All right, that's great. Well, thanks very much. It's great to see so many of you have come back for this morning's first panel. So welcome back to IPI's World Conference. It's great to see so many of you here. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's day, which I thought was full of some fantastic sessions on press freedom or artificial intelligence, and then the chance to sort of relax and take in a few films as well. This morning we have a very important panel on media capture. Media capture, as we understand it, is the use of economic and political vested interests to take control of and influence the editorial policies of media. IPI has been working particularly hard on it over the past few years in Europe because it's one of those mechanisms for suppressing media freedom which doesn't fill the headlines. We don't see journalists being arrested. We don't see newsrooms being raided. Journalists aren't being attacked under media capture. Instead, it's a process of silencing independent journalism by stealth. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that we have that Beata Balagova, who is a former board member of the International Press Institute and the editor-in-chief of one of the largest Slovak dailies, SME, is also one of the sort of victims of an oligarch attempt to take over her media. And she will be leading the panel this morning. So I'd like to hand over to you, and good luck. We've got 1 hour.
Thank you so much. Good morning. There is already one positive aspect that the room is almost filled, because that shows that you are actually interested to hear our stories about media capture. The alternative name or title of this panel could be that autocrats innovate as well. And I think that's a very correct description what we are going to talk about. As we have heard several times, media capture has become the main export product of Hungary by now. Viktor Orban was able to create a propaganda machinery in a European Union member state, which in its effect even surpasses the communist propaganda system. And this is a very serious indicator. The Orban model actually inspires autocrats across the region. I have seen how Robert Fico, the former prime minister, who was forced to step down after the murder of Jan Kuciak, is now to come back. And in September he might win the elections, and he's using the same strategies as Viktor Orban. His main argument is that George Soros is financing media and financing the NGO and the civil society to make sure that Brussels' anti-family policies and anti-nation, anti-identity policies are implemented. And that works with part of the society. But of course, media capture has deadly variations also in distant democracies, I mean distant from European perspective. And independent media is fragile in most post-communist countries by today. They fell victim of the oligarchic shopping craze, or they are facing governmental pressure, but also simply burnout of critical journalists or news fatigue. And they are also losing many battles with disinformation media. So that really creates a very sensitive situation when we cannot afford we cannot afford just keep talking and keep saying how serious the situation is. That's why we will try to focus also on strategies, how to cope with the situation, And with the help of my esteemed colleagues, we will point out the most serious challenges that we are facing today, and then we talk to strategies. Márton Gergely is the editor-in-chief of HVG, one of Hungary's remaining independent media, and I know him for more than almost a decade. And so thanks to him, I was able to follow developments in Hungary, which is a very fragmented environment. There are few independent media left, and they are really fighting for a narrow group of readers. And my question to Márton would be, and then as we go on, I will also always introduce other members of the panel when I ask them to make their contribution. So when for years you are struggling to survive, what impact does it have on the media environment when survival becomes the normal? And I assume that it impacts media quality, it impacts journalistic integrity, your ability to control power. So how is it possible to exist in such a mode?
Thanks, Beata, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. Perhaps you said that oligarch or autocrats innovate too. I would start with the newest innovation of the Orbán regime. They have decriminalized defamation this week. So we were speaking a lot about slap suits. This is on the contrary. What they are doing is they are allowing their own propaganda journalists to be even more attacking the opposition. And as the European Union is pushing for slight reform of the judiciary, and as propaganda journalists would be affected by it, so now they decriminalize defamation to use it against the opposition. It seems like more freedom of press, but it's actually freedom of the attacking propaganda journalists. Why do they do that? Because we have to confess right now they are winning. If we look at the numbers, for a long term, we were always saying that in the internet, among the portals, they won't be able to achieve a dominance because you have to have innovation there. There's no hurdles for the readers to reach the content. So if the remaining free portals do their job correctly and innovating enough, that would mean that there's still a wide space for free and independent news on the World Wide Web. But that has changed. We see in the numbers that they have achieved to overtake the two big portals. And although 2 years ago, half of the media world was moved by the team of Index, who stood up and left the editorial room. They are partly the best journalists Hungary has. They have managed to build up a new portal, Telex, and that's an innovation, and that's a success story we always tell. We don't tell the other side of the moon, the dark side of the moon, meaning that Index has hired journalists who have no names, who are unknown, but because they have that huge legacy media in their back, they are double as big as Telex is. So netto, the government won. And in all those cases, netto, the government won. They shut down Népszabadság, which had 36,000 circulation, and only 10,000 people remained, so decided to choose another free and independent media to subscribe. So it means that 3/4 of the readership has stopped paying for quality content. Netto, they win. What does it mean? It means that we exist because they can afford us, politically, and we are even good for them because, for example, HVG, my newspaper, has really ironic and hurtful satiric covers about the Hungarian government, and we hear that they are showing us in Brussels, they are showing us behind closed doors. How can you say there's no press freedom if HVG can do this to us? So we are in, let's say, a golden cage, a few of us, and because our readership goes down, because Facebook needs profit, and they have and we don't pay enough, and we don't want to be we don't want to work with emotions in our postings, because we want to be fair and balanced, and fair and balanced is not what drives the clicks. So right now what's happening is that we lose leadership. We see that the impact we are having is zero, to be now very pessimistic. So, and as you said, Beata, there's a shift in what in the definition of journalistic success on the side of the independent media. Journalistic success is survival, but that's not a journalistic goal. And it means that the different remaining independent media outlets are focusing on their financing strategy. One is micro-donorship, which could work for small investigative platforms, but for main portals, it is difficult because it undermines credibility. It brings you to oversell your story. It brings you to show something else that you are not. And on the other hand, it makes an infight, because those who are going with the paywall, they of course suffer with this idea that having a paywall is cutting off even more people from quality news. So it has been a demoralizing 1.5 years. No big shifts, no big takeovers, no big drama has been happening. What has been happening was a steady demoralization, people giving up their jobs, people openly telling why it is actually the right thing to do to quit, and to see that more and more editorial newsrooms are suffering with that, and putting that emphasis on survival, and compromising the quality with it.
While my newspaper was taken over by Penta more than 7 years ago, and during that time we were not able to innovate. We really were not able to hire new people, because the only way this toxic investor was able to control us was not to approve additional finances. And I was wondering, how is it in a captured media environment when your main strategy is survival, and you look around and in other Western democracies, media is really, not only Western democracies, but in many countries, media is innovating. They explore new ways of talking to audience. They are extending audience. What's left to players on such a captured media market, if that's what you described has become a normal for you?
you know, we always knew that it's a long distance running, but as the financial problems started through media capture, through the dominance of the state on the media advertising market, and so most of the editorial rooms decided to focus on the big thing, on domestic issues, on corruption, on investigative journalism, which was the right thing to do. There was one victim of it. It was foreign coverage, and as Hungarian is a dead-end language, people don't really speak other languages, so they don't get first-hand information about the source of migration or the true face of the Ukraine war, or even what's happening in Vienna. So that was a big problem. That helped Orban to build his narrative about a world gone crazy and Highland Hungary, so the safe space Hungary. But otherwise, the newsrooms made the right decision. Less sport journalists, more investigative journalists. It always meant that we had to, because we were underfinanced, we had to do live blogging, Champions League finals with investigative journalists, because we didn't have the sports ones. But still, it was worth it. But I think that now, 13 years in, I see a slight change that the investigative journalists didn't bring anything. We had a midterm election 2 weeks ago at a city which is suffering heavily under a huge Asian battery factory. And as they were starting to demonstrate it, so demonstrate against it, the Hungarian government first decided to, with a decree, take the land from the municipality and declare it a state land. And then they took the tax, which the factory was paying for the municipality. So they were, openly hostile to that city, led by the opposition. The opposition couldn't fight that. They have measured water pollution and everything. And so there was a breakdown of that municipality. There had to be a new election. And the people in the city of Göd decided to go with a Orban man, because he might save them for a part of the harm. We at HVG have written 2 years long about the pollution, about the risks, about the corruption with it, about the government punishing that municipality. We have brought every aspect of it to the public. And then 2 weeks ago, they elect a Fidesz man to lead the town. So if you go through this, you will find editorial rooms going the other way now and asking us, where are the sport journalists? Because if we want to survive, and it doesn't make any sense to have the investigative journalists, because our numbers are going down, there's no effect at all. Let's write better articles about the Champions League, and perhaps our numbers will go up, or we will find advertisers who back us. And of course, we are not giving up on our core business. Of course, we are doing political journalism. But there's a shift in the thinking of how can we arrange with this whole political system and demotivation of our readers, demotivation of our journalists. So let's talk about AI. It's a buzzword. Why not? And that is, it serves our survival, and of course we still exist. We don't exist because Orban said HVG can exist. We exist because we have made the right choices and because we have made the right choices with our financing, that we are healthy, that we have a subscription, a digital subscription too. So we work hard for our independence. But right now, this demotivation means that we are thinking the other way as we were going the last 10 years.
Marton, thank you so much, especially also for that last comment, because this is the challenge many of us face. I mean, my newspaper as well is seeing that interest in hard news is dropping. I also face questions. Do we want to, why don't you hire more journalists who cover lifestyle? Are we going to strengthen sport reporting because we need to maintain visits to our websites? And that's also a very serious development. But now I would like to give the word to Srinivasan Jain, or Vasu, who is a television journalist from India. He quit from NDTV after a toxic media tycoon, Adani, took over his channel. What Adani did is also very similar to what Penta did to our SME newsroom. And he will talk about how media capture in India might compare to media capture in Eastern Europe, but also the specifics of the media capture in India. Please.
Right. Thanks very much indeed, Beata and IPI for having me on this panel. I think there's a certain unintentional irony in the title of this panel, like cutting loose from media capture, because in a sense, that's what's happened to like all of us. Media capture has cut us loose. 3 months ago, I was heading a news network in India, as you mentioned, and now the sort of upside is that you can sit in a seminar in Vienna's museum quarter without stressing about the morning Zoom call. So, but I think that this whole sort of exercise that we are going through for the past 48 hours here at this IPI event is a kind of act of collective catharsis, because we're all essentially telling the same story in these rooms about what's happening with our countries. And just listening to Marton and to your experience, it's striking how similar the playbooks are, with some variations. So I think that just to give you a little bit of the context of what's been going on in India, and you may have also heard it if you had attended some of the other sessions with the Indian journalists, that I think it's quite remarkable, given the sort of the acute state of capture we're in, where a large swath of the Indian media, particularly television networks, have either become propagandists of the government or take a very safe line when it comes to covering the regime, is the scale of the Indian media. So we have probably the most diverse and largest media market on the planet. To give you a sense, we have 400 registered news channels. That's just registered news channels, not the ones that operate out of garages and so on. And we have 100,000 registered newspapers. Now, it's not as if that India had a very great record of press freedom. It was always fragile. We have investigating agencies, federal agencies that act under the whim of the government. There isn't a great deal of public investment in the idea of media freedom. The judiciary and the other safeguards, the institutions that are meant to safeguard democracy, have always been also open to political pressures. But the diversity, the idea that you have hundreds of news channels and hundreds of newspapers, provide you with a sense of having that diversity of opinion. So just a fun fact, political parties in India own news channels as well. There's a state in Tamil Nadu where the leading news network is called Sun TV, which also happens to be the logo of the political party that rules the state, the DMK. So one wing of this family runs a news network, the other wing runs the political side. Their main rival was a politician called Jayalalitha, who started her own channel, somewhat imaginatively called Jaya TV. So this is not to say that this is ideal, but in a bizarre way, you do get a diversity of views. So this vast fragmented landscape was a strength for the longest period of time, till the point where it actually became a weakness because it led to the fragmentation of the advertising and the revenue market. So you just had too many mouths to feed. You had too large a media landscape and not enough resources to fund them. And so the trend towards what we see now actually began pre-Modi, pre the arrival of the Modi regime, where in order to sustain revenue, there was a drop in standards, and there was acute tabloidization to chase ratings and so on and so forth. That led to a drop in the trust deficit with the media. That led to a large number of media entrepreneurs and media houses becoming financially fragile and compromised, and therefore dependent on dubious actors like media conglomerates, like big business conglomerates and oligarchs and so on to bail them out. And it's in this context that somebody like a Modi arrives, who very much like the Orban model or the Erdogan model, is bringing a sledgehammer to this very fragile structure we have, because you now have an authoritarian, majoritarian demagogue who has scant regard for any of these democratic niceties. And essentially, the sort of the visible way in which he approached this was to say that this is a liberal bias in the existing mainstream media, and again, a very familiar playbook, and that this has been kind of prejudicial to the Hindu nationalist ideology which he represents. And what I'm actually doing is ideological correction. I'm not doing media capture, or I'm not actually doing any kind of intimidation. But that was the visible rhetoric. But invisibly, what was happening is, and I think you mentioned this in the introduction, that you just had, through a mixture of intimidation, through a mixture of kind of cutting off access, and through actual outright raids and punitive action on media houses, that you managed to do this huge shift where, pretty much like how a tree falls in the forest at night and no one sees, you have this kind of invisible shift where this vast sort of media landscape has largely been brought to heel. Now, if you try to resist, there are consequences. So the network I worked for sort of broadly decided not to cave into both waves of bad media practice, which is the sort of the tabloidization phase. We kind of took the middle path. We didn't go down that path. And then even after the regime change happened, we continued to interrogate the Modi regime, just as we had the previous regime. We held them to account for the bigotry, the propaganda, the attack on democratic institutions. The net result is that we were raided by and investigated by every federal agency under the wings of the government. The one that investigates financial crimes, the one that investigates corruption, income tax, market regulator. My bosses were not allowed to fly out of the country. Their homes were raided. Our CEOs and our financial heads were constantly called in to be questioned. Our advertisers were intimidated, in some cases with direct phone calls to back off. And so that's the sort of costs that you pay. But we were still sputtering on in this sort of environment, till finally in August last year, when Adani, who briefly was the world's second richest man and very close to the current regime, bought a kind of controlling stake, which then culminated in the sort of the takeover of the channel and the exit of some of us earlier this year.
One would really think that in democratic societies, the public might have information and might understand that the media takeover has pretty grave consequences on the functioning of the whole country.
Right.
So how does the Indian society react to that? Is there like a healthy core of Indians who understand that this is actually a dangerous path, or how actually your readers are reacting to that?
Right. So this has been the great, I think, disappointment in all of our countries when you look at the sort of public reaction to what's been going on. So the weird thing is that, that it's actually, for a lot of the media owners, caving in and taking a propagandist line has not just meant that you buy peace, but it's actually also, in a sense, not bad for the bottom line, because the sort of the media networks that are the biggest propagandists of the government are also the ones with the highest ratings. So there seems to be this almost bottomless appetite amongst Indian audiences for a constant stream of propaganda, for fawning over the great leader, for a stream of bigoted and Islamophobic reportage which suits very much the narrative of the regime. So everything that you learn as journalists, right? The idea is that you break big stories, you scoop the government, you get a minister to resign, and that's how you also get good ratings or you get more revenue, is now the reverse. So there's actually, in a sense, a more profitable business model of actually speaking power's version of the truth as opposed to speaking truth to power. This is one side of it. There is another side where increasingly, because just as with your journey and with other journeys, we've now had almost 10 years of this. And there is a sense where there is a kind of disaffection seeping in. And this huge swath of propagandist media now actually is called Godi media, which Godi in Hindi means lap. And it's a term coined by a former colleague of mine who also quit with me, that this is the media that sits in the lap of the government. And now you actually will find people in public, when they see these channels coming and covering, let's say, an event which they will cover very much with the government line. Like there was a huge farmers' protest 2 years ago, which some of you may have heard about. They were protesting some laws by the government which they didn't like. And then you'll actually have people coming up to the reporters and journalists of this network and saying, Godi media is not wanted here. Go back. So there is a shift, but it is, I still feel, not significant enough to lead to a big change when it comes to the sort of the line taken by media owners or by advertisers and so on. Partly because, and this is my last point here, that I think what the regime has successfully done, and I'm sure this is very much similar in Hungary and elsewhere, is they've shifted the sort of public common sense as to what India is. So there's now a great acceptance of the fact that we are actually a kind of majoritarian autocracy, from being kind of broadly imperfect but liberal and fragile democracy, that has now become the kind of unspoken common sense. And so when you reflect that in your media, you're actually, in a sense, pandering and playing to that. And I think that's been one of the great devious and malign successes of the regime. And that's going to be a big challenge commercially. How do you break from that and yet are able to sort of sustain yourself financially?
Well, so thank you so much. Among your many excellent points, I will pick one. As you very rightly pointed at, the fact that the media capture necessarily on long term results in the drop of quality of journalism. And of course, we celebrate journalists who are able to continue their work in oppressed and difficult environments. But just again, a point, we have seen the drop in number of investigative journalists in Slovakia, in Hungary, and it necessarily means weakening the ability to control governments. And while we have been in conversation with the European Union and its organizations about media capture in Hungary, it's the EU, and we have been blaming the EU to react pretty late to what happened in Hungary. And I myself several times argued that, we media are your real ally in protecting democracy and protecting your values if you are serious about them, and you are tiptoeing around Viktor Orban and sacrificing us the critical media. But finally, the European Union came up with a legislative solution, and this is the European Media Freedom Act. It was originally designed to address difficulties in Hungary and Poland, but it was it wasn't tailor-made just for these two countries. I am now giving the floor to Lucia Sikorova. She's the chair of the supervisory board of the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, and we will try to look at first the positives, or what actually works from this so far the most complex legislative change proposed by the Union. So, Lucia, if you could briefly list those parts of the regulation which you think could help media independence in post-communist countries.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning to everybody. Yes, so indeed, the Media Freedom Act was meant to prevent situation what happened in Poland and Hungary. So it's rather difficult now to target the reality what happened already, but now to prevent such situation in other states. So, but I also would be curious then to hear how Hungarian colleagues see it, if that still can help it in your situation. However, there was mentioned several times financing of independent media, a crucial first issue. So unfortunately, this is not being solved by Media Freedom Act, but there are several points which can still help the situation to create an environment for media to remain independent. Regarding the financing, there's one really important point, which is the Act says the state advertisement must be there must be transparency how it's allocated. So all states must make transparent how they allocate their advertisement, to which media it goes. So it would at least show which media are supported by the state through this way. Till now, in Czech Republic, when I can mention, I come from Czech Republic, we had a commissioner for disinformation, Michal Klima, and even he wasn't able to find out how this was done in the past, so how the state advertisement was allocated, who was supported. So one important point, Media Freedom Act would also ensure independence of public service media, independence and stable financing. So the Act is asking states to ensure stable financing also for public service media. Another important point is protecting journalists from state interference. So it's so it wouldn't be possible to deploy spyware, for example, into journalists' devices, or to order revealing journalist sources. So yes, these cases which are not that often discussed maybe, but in our countries yet, but we see this very often in Turkey. We had yesterday cases, and it's coming also into our country. So another important point to prevent such cases. IPI and EFJ journalists, professional organizations called to strengthen these points, even to make a bigger protection even for journalists in this regard. Well, then we have another point, which is assessment of media concentration. So this is a point where big publishers are very much against. They feel addressed, and they are also addressed, because has been stated in many researches already that big media concentration in many countries is dangerous for plurality, media plurality. And we see, of course, big concentration in Czech Republic where media are captured by oligarchs. We see media concentration in Hungary where all the media are in KESMA, in the government's foundation. And it has obviously huge impact on the media independence and the whole market. But maybe a bit surprising result now of the reactions. What we saw, of course, Hungary and Poland are very loud against this article, this regulation. But also Germany, for example, which was actually quite surprising for some. Germany's official statement or explanation on this was that they have actually already very good regulation of media on national level, so they don't need any European act or another regulation. However, what we see in reality is that there is a huge impact of big publishers on political views and decisions. So again, even here, even when that's not that obvious maybe for many, the concentration of the market and the huge influence of big publishers can be a problem even in Germany, obviously. Of course, some Nordic countries have a concentration which has opposite impact, which means that big publishers support small outlets and enable them to survive. So that was a big, a bit controversial discussions what we had with these publishers. However, at the end they recognized that such an act would be a prevention, a very important prevention for seeing this bad influence in spreading, as you mentioned at the beginning, that the biggest export product of Hungary is are these manners and this handling this media market. So Nordic countries recognized this danger, and at the end they agreed that this is important, even if they were afraid of having this regulation. And they also understand that this act should not regulate those countries where the system is functional very well and there's no problem with plurality of media and media freedom, but would help states where this doesn't work. So to these positive points, maybe if that's clear enough. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, and maybe just one comment that, yes, it has been almost like fight of forces, like how to balance, a whole European law, which some countries which are affected by media capture feel that the provisions are not strong enough, and then you have countries where they have a feeling that the provisions would interfere into a already well-functioning market. But it also gets to us to the point that you can have great legislation everybody agrees on, but unless you have mechanisms how to enforce them in the countries, they are just on paper and they are a PR material that you can show up that we address the issue. And again, it goes back to the fact that autocrats are very creative in tricking, any provision. And while the control mechanisms so far are set and they are entrusted to national regulators and to nominees into a board, which again are picked by the national regulators, which are very often intertwined with political parties. And I mean, in Slovakia and in other post-communist countries, we have a history of politically underlined people who sit on the board. So what would be the solution to that question? How to ensure that if you have a board which are supposed to control how you keep the law, what is the alternative to what is proposed by the Union? Is there any, or how to solve the issue of control and maybe also penalties
That's basically why the Commission proposed to create a media board, a new media board, a new body which would advise the Commission or European regulators how's the situation in each country and where they should take some action. So this media board is of course also an object of many discussions, the independence of this new board, the independence on the Commission and on the national governments. The newest information we have at the end, maybe the Commission would be just left out of this because there were too many. It was actually a reason for some states even to speak against the whole act. So I think we don't have to be afraid of the influence of the Commission at the end, but the other way around, what you mentioned, how to ensure that members of this new board would be independent on the from the national governments, because the original proposal says that this would be national regulators, members of ERGA, which are in many countries not even independent and influence. The other point is that they are in many countries like ours not relevant even for print and online media because they were till now focused only on audiovisual media. So and now they should assess the situation on the whole media market. So these are two main problems. We proposed as European Centre of Press and Media Freedom, together with few MEPs, an amendment which would create an advisory body of this media board, at least, where professional organizations or academics from each country would be members, and so in our point of view this could be a way how these assessments, which would be crucial for Commission to decide if to take an action or not, that at least the relevant people could have their say to this, and that this would really illustrate the real situation in each country. So this would be basically an instrument. The Commission, based on these assessments, would then take an action to decide if to limit EU support or whatever. So,
Thank you, Lucia. As we said, the Media Freedom Act does not address financing, especially not financing of independent media. And we have among us Patrice Schneider, the Chief Strategy Officer of the Media Investment Development Fund. And this fund, over the past almost 3 decades, helped the survival of key players on troubled markets. Yet the autocratic and oligarchic media capture in post-communist countries created a need for stable, politically independent, predictable and long-term financing. Patrice, is there a possibility to provide that financing at all?
So I promised to Beata that I will hook myself to whatever my panelists were saying, but thank you, it's impossible. The richness of what you've all three said is impossible, so I will follow the question that Beata just posed. Is it possible to fund that, but also probably use the hook she used at the beginning? Autocrats are using innovation, and please follow me to humbly contribute to this very rich controversy. So the autocrats are around the world innovating in terms of things, and I believe that my organization has created a fragile but promising innovation, and let me bring you to it to answer the question if it's possible to fund. The first thing is that, so I work for the Media Development Investment Fund. For those of you who don't know who we are, this is not a pitch. I'm trying to lay the land for the answering of the question, I promise, Beata. We consider ourselves a combination of a human rights organization, the right to access unfettered information unbiased. That's a human right. And an investment fund. So we are a combination of a human rights organization and investment fund for 30 years. Now, if you think this is either weird or fascinating, it is absolutely. I love what I do and so forth. And growing closer to the question of media capture, we were following basically the trajectory of Fukuyama over the historical trajectory, which says the liberal democracy would actually, the end of history, they would just, and if you look at the trajectory of MDIF, my organization, this binome, this sort of double organization, we started in the Balkans, started in former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and then we've moved on to Latin America, to Southeast Asia, now in India also, and Sub-Saharan Africa. But then something happened, which was media capture. I do not want to explain to this group what media capture is. But I think what was interesting is that people came to us, so certainly the resources funding independent media through us, the people who do the real work, tell us what can we do about this media capture subject. In a way, a reversal of what Fukuyama was said. No, sorry, it's not the end of history, we're gonna have to go back. And I think the solution we came with was this fragile, but a lot of potential innovation. So the idea would be, of course, I hope I'm complementary to what Lucy was saying. We are going to the notion of private. So we're really not using government money. The idea, and in a way there's a philosophical position as I was listening to all you, it says, we're really alone. Anyone who believes that public information is a common good that we need, we're alone. Okay, we're gonna have to fix this on our own. And maybe the government is not going to be the solution for this and so forth. So I think in line with that, our solution was the following thing, was on media capture in Central Europe, which I will not describe, you know, would be to create, and using the concept of ownership, we would raise 100 million euros to stop the media capture in Eastern Europe. 100 million euros. It's nothing, but for us, it was a lot. We are not at 50 million. We've raised half of it, and we've stopped 3 media captures in Europe. The third one is going to be shortly announced. The first one was, with immense pride, was Daily Swing in Czech Republic, allowing us to have exited an ill-intent investment group inside one of the most vocal voice, not only in Slovakia, but in Europe. So 50 million, we've stopped the capture of 30. What does that answer the question of Beata, how can we fund that? And I think the fragile innovation was, of course, to say we will do it only with private money. So we're talking foundations. Okay, Patrice, it's normal. Second, reputable European news media company who traditionally have gone into these markets, made money, and then when heat starts, they leave and they sell perhaps not to the best intended person in that part. But these companies now, there are some reputable European media companies who are waking up and saying, whoa, if the public discourse collapses, not only the society hurt, but also our own business hurts. And finally, once we got that duo of the 50 million, we realized that high net worth individual, the notion of impact capital, individuals in Europe that go beyond the market returns. This is, I want to invest my money, but I don't want a market return necessarily. I want it to contribute to society. Don't get me started on the subject of zebra, but that's a key word if you want to after it. So then we went from foundations, reputable media companies, high net worth individual, and then banks. We announced in 28th of March, the first GLS Bank, the largest ethical bank in Germany and in Europe, has created a media plurality bond. If you are a retail investor, you like me and you, well, I mean, I'm a retail investor, you can literally buy a bond at the largest ethical bank in Germany that funds this entity and fuels the 50 million. Now, where's the fragile innovation into this? I believe there's two. The first one is blended capital. Suddenly, it's not one owner. And I don't want to open this conversation, but we're seeing that in this fragile innovation, it's not just solving the problem of media capture, but it could be solving the much bigger picture which Martin hinted with GAFA, but also that Vasu did in terms of who owns what. Perhaps blended capital will allow you, certainly from a governance point of view, to be able to have now one entity that controls the narrative. Is it hard? It's super hard. because you have multiple voices. But perhaps this logic of private ownership that is blended allows that. So that was the first lesson. And then the last lesson, which points to the question, can we fund that? One of the lessons, so this entity of 100 million is called Pluralis. Some of you might have learned it. I need to do a stop here. Pluralis, why? If you are raising 100 million to stop the media capture of independent voices in Central Europe, you are going after a liberal democracy narrative. But that's not a vision going against liberal democracy. Who am I to say that Orban is wrong? It's not a vision. The vision is plurality. Our goal would be that at least at the end of the day in Slovakia, one voice remains to maintain something different, such as what Orwell said, howling with the wolves. Somebody doesn't holler with the wolves. And I think that's where I commend the work of all, what you've done also in India in the past and so forth, and certainly what you are fighting against it. So pluralis is about plurality, it's about media plurality, just maintaining that. End of the parenthesis. But the second part of the innovation is that this fragile but with immense potential is that if all these typology I've just said, foundation, reputable media company, high net worth individual with patient capital, and banks, commercial entities that say it's enough. There's a vision about playing a role in society that we cannot let the public display. Is it possible that there is a call, a bit with what Vasu was saying in India, saying, people are starting to say, go the media. I mean, that is a sign. And perhaps at the end of the day, we are alone, but we're not alone. We're not alone. Civil society may have to say, listen, 50 years ago, and this will be my last, 50 years ago, we thought that fossil fuel would really grow the human progress. 60 years ago, it was normal. It was going to grow. And now we realize that, whoa. There was a big price to pay for that. And I think we're in the middle of it, perhaps a consciousness about all of us to say, wait, it's one thing to have big tech coming in, but technology, take it, giveth, technology gave. Maybe we are at that moment. And it's the same thing about probably we need to get involved into owning the public discourse.
Yeah, thank you, Patrice. I didn't want to interrupt you, but certainly we should talk a little bit about how universal this model is, and probably there are limitations to this financing. And you are probably overviewing what you have done so far, and while you look at the Central European media landscape, you look at Hungary, it becomes obvious that perhaps there are some limitations. Can we talk a little bit about that?
So the limitation, I think, well, Vasu gave me the answer to that one. I think first of all, I think if you take this concept of blended funding, pluralis, raising capital from parts of civil society and corporate society saying, we want this impulse, I think it will have a cultural flavor to it. I think what works in Slovakia might work in Hungary or in Europe in terms of saying there's a sensitivity of the space, the philosophical space, that might work. But now listening to Vasu in India, the fact that it existed before in which the capture, it was a fragile environment where capture existed, but it was diverse. That's a fascinating paradox in a way. It was captured, but it was diverse. And then arrives an autocrat on the weakness of it. So in that sense, it guides me in saying that with how universal this is, it would probably look completely different in India. However, perhaps the idea that you have diverse capital coming into a central ownership that does not allow you to control it. Pluralis will never be sold. It's impossible. The governance is locked completely. So I think my short answer is that I think the United States is now looking into the subject of pluralis because they're saying, well, the media deserts and they're not talking about the New York Times. They're talking about the small local newspaper, which can't cover the local authority government, which is creating a huge problem. Do you think it's going to be banks, foundation, high net worth individuals, and companies that are going to get into that mix? I don't know. But let's sit down and see what the community, the ecosystem and the organic ecosystem of a community that might be different. I do believe it's a potential, I think there's a potential of I think the central point is that civil society has to start understanding that a free flow of information is the part of the common good. And if we use that, let's see what it looks like and how universal that can be.
Thank you so much, Patrice. I was told by colleagues from IPI that we have left 5 minutes, so I would like to give space to some questions, if there are any. Yeah, there are.
Hi, hello, I'm Orsolya Seregei. I'm coming from Serbia. I'm working for the Sajtószabadság Alapítvány. We are the only Hungarian language independent newsroom in Serbia. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel, depending on media capture? Because we truly feel like we are swimming against a current at the moment.
Who would like to answer that difficult question? Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Yeah, we have no choice but to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I was wondering quite intensively that at the time when communism collapsed, we thought that with coming democracy, automatically some of the values will be maintained. But now we are seeing that over the past decade, actually we are experiencing a radical decline. And because it's not just like fluctuation for 2 or 3 years, so autocrats are counting on the fact that we give in. They are counting on the fact that we will switch to a survival mode and that eventually we will be cooked like that famous frog in the boiling water. And so I think that the only way to ensure that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, it's supporting any initiative, not only creating new media, but also explaining players on the market that there is no other way, just cooperation. Just, there is of course, naturally, there is a natural competition at every market, even in captured environments, as we described in Hungary. But unless the players understand that they need to support the remaining independent voices, then we are heading towards the darkness in the tunnel, and we won't see the light. And I believe that by explaining this to the indifferent public, we are facing a long and very tiring road, but there is no other option. So I don't think we can afford the image that there is no light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I like the story behind Hanukkah, the Jewish fest, where they reconquered the temple and they found enough oil for 1 day to burn. And the wonder was that it burned 8 days. So what happened on day 9? Was it dark in the temple? No, it wasn't, because it took 8 days to produce new oil. So on the 9th day, it was normal to have light. So this is the story I try to tell to my colleagues, that we are the ones who try to, work for that oil, that as the darkness is over, we will manage to have light as normality. It's you have to be idealistic or stupid to work in free media right now. And sometimes I feel stupid, and sometimes I feel idealistic. And if I'm idealistic, this is the story which makes me go on.
I'll just add to that very quickly two lines, one of which I heard from one of the panelists in El Salvador yesterday, where the same question comes up of what's the point about it all. And he says, I think one of his colleagues told him that at least we gave the bastards a hard time. So that was one, if I'm allowed to use that word. And the other is a former colleague of mine who says that, I know it all seems futile now, but when history looks back at this moment and says, at least you were there and you were fighting the good fight, and that counts for something.
Yeah, and maybe one last point that the mission also includes to preserve journalism in a way like it was passed to us by previous generation of excellent journalists. If we give up, can you imagine that a young journalist in 10 years, how they will understand journalism? Will they understand it as short Instagram posts about what they did at the morning, or couple sentence information about what the government decided? So we are really experiencing a crucial time where we have to also maintain basic values of journalism and its role of controlling power. Because autocrats are persuading us that no, and persuading the public that the role of journalism is to bring information and to entertain, and that's not the entire truth about what we journalists have to do. I think, do we have time for one more question, or?
I'm sorry, I'm afraid
Okay,
not.
so thank you so much for your
Big round
interest.
of applause.